What if I told you the United States of America almost didn't exist? Not because of a lost battle, not because of failed strategy, but because of two mysterious nights where it could have been viewed as a divine intervention or impossible coincidence. Two events that no general planned, no king ordered, no historian could fully explain. Events so perfectly timed that for centuries people have asked the same question: was this luck or was this something more? George Washington is famous for crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night, but there was another river crossing, one far more forgotten and surrounded by mystery. Our first forgotten account, we go back to the summer of 1776, to the East River. To understand what happened on August night, you first have to understand just how bad things were for George Washington at that time. It was the summer of 1776. The Declaration of Independence had just been signed. Bold words on paper, but the ink was barely dry. And on the ground, there was a battle. The British had arrived in New York Harbor with a large force, over 32,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, and 400 ships. Against them stood Washington's ragged Continental Army, roughly 19,000 men, many of whom were untrained militia who have never been in a real battle. On August 27th, the British launched a devastating assault on Long Island, the Battle of Brooklyn, the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War. Within hours, the Continental Army was shattered. Over 1,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. Washington's men fled in panic to their base positions at Brooklyn Heights, and now they were trapped. In front of them, General William Howe's massive British army closing in. Behind them, the East River, 3/4 of a mile of cold, fast-moving water. And hovering in the harbor was the British Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet on Earth at that time. If those warships moved up the river, they would cut off every escape route that Washington's army had. Every single American soldier on Long Island would be captured or killed, and then the Revolutionary War would be over. Washington most likely knew this. His officers knew this. On the night of August 29th, he made a desperate decision, a secret decision. He would attempt to evacuate his entire army, nearly 9,000 men, across the East River, in the dark, in silence, without the British knowing. It was, by any measure, nearly impossible task to do. Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment, fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts, retrieved every boat that they could find, flat-bottomed ferries, sailboats, rowboats, anything that could float. The crossing began around 9 o'clock at night. Soldiers were ordered to muffle their oars, no talking, no coughing. Horses were sedated. A single mistake, a shout, a splash, a lantern glimpsed by the wrong eyes, and the British would know. The fleet would move, and it would be over. For hours, the boats crossed back and forth, but the operation was painfully slow. As midnight approached, Washington and his officers looked at the sky with dread. They had only a few hours of darkness left. Thousands of men were still on the Brooklyn side. And then the wind shifted. It began to blow from the northeast, the wrong direction for sailing the boats that made a part of the crossing fleet. The larger vessels couldn't make the trip. The evacuation slowed to nearly a halt. Washington stood on the shore and watched his clock. Dawn was coming, and his dawn discovery, and with discovery came danger. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, fog began to roll in off the water. Not an ordinary fog, but a dense, thick fog, the kind that sailors in the region would later describe it being unlike anything they've seen in years. It settled over the East River, over Brooklyn Heights, over the British camps. Within minutes, you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Major Benjamin Talmadge, who was there that night, later wrote in his memoirs that the fog was so remarkably dense that a man only a few yards away could not be seen. And here it was, The fog was so astonishing. On the Manhattan side of the river, just 3/4 miles away, there was no fog. The sky was clear. But on the Brooklyn side, Washington's men moved like ghosts through a white, silent wall of mist. The evacuation accelerated. The fishermen of Marblehead rowed harder, faster. Thousands of men moved down to the shore in the dark, and the fog stepped into the boats and disappeared across the water. Artillery was dragged to the riverbank. Horses crossed. Wagons crossed. Washington himself was one of the last men to leave. As the fog held and the boats kept moving, nearly 9,000 Continental soldiers crossed the East River without losing a single man. When the fog finally lifted, when British scouts crept forward to the American positions, they found abandoned campfires, empty trenches, silence. Washington's entire army had vanished. The British were stunned. General Howe had been hours away from ending the war, hours away from capturing Washington himself, and something, a fog that appeared from nowhere at exactly the right moment, had held until the last boat crossed. What happened in that fog on August night was something else entirely. It was a miraculous timing. On to the second forgotten story. Later that same year, 1776, the British marched into New York City and occupied it completely. For Washington, it was a painful, humiliating loss. But before he left, Washington asked his commanders a question, a cold, calculated question. Should we burn it? He wrote to the Continental Congress arguing that if Americans could not hold New York, they should deny it to the British, burn the city to the ground, leave nothing for the enemy to use, no shelter, no supplies, no comfort through the winter. Congress refused. They ordered Washington not to destroy the city. New York was an American property. It would be liberated one day. Burning it down was not an option. Washington obeyed the order. He withdrew his troops and they went northward. And then on the night of September 20th, 1776, just 5 days after the British completed their occupation, New York City began to burn. It started near the waterfront in Lower Manhattan in the early hours before dawn. The wind was strong that night, blowing from the south, and wooden buildings of the colonial New York caught like kettling. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Block after block ignited. Church steeples became torches, taverns, warehouses, homes, all of it burning. British soldiers and sailors formed bucket brigades, desperately trying to stop the blaze. But it wasn't enough. By morning, nearly 500 buildings were destroyed. Some estimates run higher. Roughly 1/4 of the entire city of New York had been reduced to ash and rubble. British General William Howe was furious. He immediately suspected sabotage. He arrested dozens of suspected American sympathizers. In the chaos, one man, a young Continental soldier named Nathan Hale, who had been operating behind enemy lines as a spy, he was captured and he was executed the following day without trial. Howe wrote to London that the fire had been set deliberately by an American agent and stayed behind specifically to burn the city that Congress had forbidden Washington to touch. To this day, no one has even proved who started the Great Fire of New York. It may have been an accident, it may have been deliberate. However, historically, it's incomplete. However, this is what the history record does show. New York City was supposed to be the crown jewel of British occupation. The plan was to use it as a central base of operations for the entire war, a headquarters, a port, a supply chain, wintering ground for tens of thousands of British troops. The fire changed that calculation permanently. With 1/4 of the city destroyed, housing was now desperately scarce. British officers seized private homes and forced residents into the streets. The remaining buildings were so overcrowded that disease began to spread through the ranks. Supply storage was compromised, and British were stuck. They couldn't simply abandon New York. It was too strategically valuable as a port and a symbol, but they had now had to pour enormous resources into maintaining it. rather than using it as a springboard for their operations. Throughout the winter of 1776 and going into the year 1777, British troops who might have been hunting down Washington across New Jersey, instead they were huddled in the ruins of New York, trying to keep warm. Washington, meanwhile, crossed the Delaware River on that Christmas night and launched his famous surprise attack on Trenton. Then Princeton, the Continental Army was suddenly winning again. The British never really recovered their strategic momentum after that winter. Howe's army, bogged down in New York, failed to coordinate with the command in Canada. That failure of coordination led directly to the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This decisive American victory that convinced France to enter the war on America's side. France's entry changed everything. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion, it was a world war, and Britain ultimately could not win it. History loves to tell the story of men of valor and who made great decisions, battles and candlelit tents, generals whose ideas turned the tide. But sometimes history shows something else, a fog that rose from nowhere and held until the last boat crossed, on a fire that started on the perfect night in the perfect place and consumed a quarter of the enemy's most vital city. 2 events, 2 nights, neither one fully explained by the history books, both of them sitting at the hinge point of American Revolution. Without the fog on the East River, Washington's entire army, the Continental Army, is captured by morning of the August 30th, 1776. The revolution ends before the Constitution is ever written, before the nation is ever born. Without the Great Fire of New York, the British winter in comfort and strength. They coordinate with forces in Canada. Saratoga never becomes the turning point it became. France never joins the war. The tide never turns. We will never know whether the fog was pure coincidence. We will never know with certainty who lit the first flame in the lower Manhattan that September night. What we do know is this: 2 strange nights, a revolution saved and a nation born. And somewhere in the gap between history and mystery, between what we can prove and what we can only wonder about, sits a question that may never fully be answered. Was it luck, or was this something more? Until next time, see you in the next video.